Today we're going to take a look at some of the different kinds of small life or microbes that we can find out there in the soil, and hopefully you'll gain a new appreciation for the vast diversity of life that is actually in the soil, something that we usually look at as really a non-living type of object that is out there. And we'll take a look at some of the backgrounds on cells and go through a variety of different microbes that are present in the soil. And throughout this, I want you to really think about this idea on how these microbes that are actually growing and reproducing in the soil are able to affect the characteristics of the soil and the plants that are actually growing in the soil. And if we take a look at the distribution of these microbes that are found in the soil out there, what we're used to thinking about is the topsoil that's out there, because this is what we run into every day. And if you think about it, in that topsoil, you're going to find a whole bunch of nutrients, because that's where your plants that are dying are landing up, and that's where the animals and other organisms that are living on the topsoil are going to be going through their life cycle. And so it's a really, really rich region that is going to have a lot of nutrients, and we find a vast number of microbes that are there. But if we go down through the soil and even get down to the bedrock here, what we can find is you can even find microbes that are growing down here. There's going to be a lot fewer because there's a lot less energy and nutrients for them to be able to reproduce and make new cells, but we can find some of these microbes even down in mines that are out there when they're digging through the bedrock. If they sample it, they can find some microbes, but nowhere near the number of microbes that we're going to find in the topsoil, where you're looking at something that is, say, the size of the end of your thumb, could potentially have up to 1 billion cells in it if it's a really rich piece of soil that's out there. And when we look at what kind of nutrients are these cells going to be getting out of the soil there, we have to remember that all cells on the planet, whether it's a bacteria all the way up through us, you're going to find 4 primary ingredients for all life that is out there. And it's what I call the CHON diet. You're going to find carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are really making up a massive amount of the dry weight of a cell that is out there. And then you've got your minor elements, things like phosphorus and potassium and sulfur. And we're familiar with this when we look at fertilizers that are out there, and we see that common kind of nomenclature for the numbers where you're looking at the ratio of NPK, and there you're looking at the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and the potassium that is out there. And so these elements are out there either floating around in the air as carbon dioxide. We have our liquid water, but also when we're looking at the soil out there, all these different kinds of nutrients that are available for the cells that are out there. And when we look at any kind of ecological group of organisms that are out there, what we find is there's 3 characteristic kinds of groups of organisms that are out there. The major group that we rely on are the producers, and these are the things that are taking the inorganic compounds. So think the rocks and the nutrients and the carbon dioxide that's floating around in the air, and the producers are using light energy to turn those inorganic compounds into organic compounds. And an organic compound is something that contains carbon that is made by cells. And we've documented the existence of millions of these kinds of organic compounds that are made by cells that are out there. And those producers are going ahead and making new organic compounds, and along comes us as a consumer, and we're going to be feeding on those producers and feeding on other consumers. So think like cows that are eating the grass out there, and then we come along and eat them. Those are the organisms that we're used to also seeing. But what we don't really pay attention to until we get something like a fungal disease are the decomposers. And these are the life that is out there, that is in that topsoil, that is taking those dead organisms, the plants and the animals that are out there, and basically recycling them. They're decomposing those organic compounds and returning some of those back to the soil, where effectively they are acting as fertilizer for the producers to continue the cycle. And if we take any one of these groups of organisms out of this ecology, then you can actually find that system can fall apart, because they really do rely on each other. And if we take a look at some of the cycling that is going on here, we can look at a simple example of the carbon cycle. And it's out there in the air, as carbon dioxide, and this is being produced by the decomposers and animals, the consumers that are out there, but it is getting recycled by the photosynthetic organisms. And we're used to seeing things like plants, but we don't think about the algae, and there's also really microscopic things called cyanobacteria that are the forebears of the plants and algae. And these are bacteria that can do photosynthesis very similar to what we find in modern day plants and algae. And so there's your producers out there taking that inorganic carbon and turning it into organic molecules, and then the consumers and the decomposers are going to be able to come along and break those things down and release that and produce that CO2. So this constant cycling is going on with CO2. And some people say that if we have an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, that would actually be beneficial for the plants that are out there, because that's going to be extra carbon for them to be able to turn into organic molecules. But it turns out there is a limit to how much of that is healthy. And one of the worries that we're experiencing now is if there is global climate change occurring, it's not only going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide, but it's also going to increase the amount of heat. And when you have that, that can actually cause the plants to dry out faster. And so it's not necessarily a good thing to have a higher production of CO2. Another cycle that we can take a look at here is another simple cycle for the recycling of nitrogen. Again, that diet of CHON that is out there, carbon and nitrogen, are two really important elements for any kind of life to have access to, and they need good amount of this. These kinds of elements. And if we look at nitrogen, it's also floating around out there in the air. The room you're sitting in is probably about 60% nitrogen, but we can't see it and we can't use it. The plants that are out there really want to have access to that nitrogen, but they also cannot use it. They are primarily getting nitrates from the soil and assimilating those through their roots. But again, when we look at the bacteria that are out there, we find a whole bunch of different bacteria are actually involved in recycling the nitrogen that is available out there. Some of these microbes that actually do live inside the roots of plants, they're called nitrogen fixers. And if you see something like an alfalfa and you pull it out of the ground, sometimes you will see these weird little round nodules on the roots, and that's actually the house where the bacteria have swum into the root, and they're hanging out in there, and the nitrogen gas that gets into the roots is able to actually be fixed by these microbes, just like the carbon dioxide that's being fixed by the plants. But these microbes are actually able to turn that nitrogen into usable forms, so effectively they are fertilizing these plants from inside of the roots. The other thing that we see is when we look at the decomposers, including us when we're releasing waste products, we're going to be releasing a lot of nitrogen in the form of ammonia. And that is not as useful for the plants that are out there, but if you look at this, you can see there are actually bacteria that are known as nitrifying bacteria that are going to take that ammonia and run it through a series of chemical reactions, and they're going to be giving off nitrates. So again, effectively, these microbes are producing fertilizer in the soil, and you can actually fertilize plants in there without having to add any exogenous source of nitrogen by adding fertilizer. And this is one of those examples where letting a field just lie fallow for a year can actually be a good thing because it restores the balance. And what they found is the more nitrogen fertilizer you add to the field, the more it actually suppresses the growth of these microbes that are out there. So by adding extra fertilizer, we're creating sort of a feedback where we have to keep adding fertilizer because it's not being replenished naturally by the microbes that are out there. And if you want to take a look at these microbes that are out there in the soil, you run into a little problem that was sort of solved by a famous microbiologist known as Winogradsky. And what you do with this is you actually take a glass tube and you pack it full of some mud or soil and add some water. And really all you need to do at this point is have a light source. Your producers are going to be floating around in there, and they're going to be producing those organic molecules. Your consumers and decomposers are going to be breaking down those producers and recycling that carbon and those nutrients back into this cycle. So we are literally creating a little planet inside of these tubes, and we can use them to look at the different kinds of microbes. And if you look at the side view here, you can see a variety of different kinds of colors here. That's actually the the microbial life that is existing inside of these columns. And so we can dig in here and actually sample to see what's going on inside of these columns here and grow them up in a little bit more controlled conditions to take a look at what's existing in that column and what was out there in the soil. And if you look sort of at a general diagram here for what's going on with the Winogradsky column, on the top, this is where we see the kind of life that we're used to thinking about, the things that can exist in the presence of oxygen in what's known as the aerobic region here. And so you will find a lot of these cyanobacteria up here on top in the water, and if you work your way down, you actually start to hit a region that is anaerobic. And this is a region where we would die because we need to have access to that oxygen in order for our cells to continue working and burning fuel out there. But the microbes that are out there have actually evolved to be able to exist in this region right here in the water, but also down here in the sediment. And you can think about this. This is like the mud at the bottom of a pond that's out there. It is full of microbes that are out there. We can't see them, but we can look at them under the microscope because they're not visible to the naked eye. And what people have found that's kind of an interesting little thing is plants that are out there are going to be taking water molecules and they split them in half to get electrons to use for photosynthesis. The production of oxygen is actually a waste product for the plants, and that's what we take in, and we use the oxygen and we actually produce water. So this is one of those recycling reactions that's going on between plants and us. But if you look at the bacteria that are out there, they're growing in this anaerobic region where there's a lack of oxygen. And their solution was to use a slightly different chemical element that is relatively plentiful out there in certain conditions. They're going to use this hydrogen sulfide right here and use that and split it, similar to what plants are doing with water molecules, and instead of producing oxygen, they're going to produce elemental sulfur. And so there is actually another one of those sulfur cycles that is going on with your bacteria that are out there. And if we think about all of this stuff is going on in the soil out there, well, what effect is this going to have on our plants that are out there? And it turns out all of these different kinds of microbe groups could be in the soil out there, and those nutrients that are being produced as they decompose things, whether it's rocks or it's dead organic material from things, that is actually going to be able to fertilize the trees that are out there. So when we consider this idea of the soil out there, you have to remember that it isn't a dead thing. It's full of living organisms that are constantly changing the profile of that soil. And what people have found is that that area in what's known as the rhizosphere, this region around where the roots are, they went in there and sampled it, and they also sampled areas far away from the roots. And what they find is there's actually a higher number of different kinds of microbes that are growing in that rhizosphere, this region around the roots. And that in science is an observation that leads people to start to question, well, why are these regions around the roots going to be higher in numbers of cells that are around there? And when they started to look into it, it turns out we always think of roots as they're sucking up the water and they're sucking up the nutrients from the soil, but it turns out it's a two-way street. And that root system on the bottom of the plants there that's growing into the soil, the plants are actually spitting out or exuding various chemicals. And so if you think about this, the microbes that are in the soil are going to be feeding those plants extra nutrients, and you don't do anything for free. Instead, what they get is the plants are going to be spitting out things like sugars and organic molecules. So those decomposers and consumers can actually get access to some of those nutrients that are coming from your plants without the plants having to die. And in biology, we call this a symbiotic relationship where these two organisms have grown to become dependent on each other.